Thank you very much. I want to thank Nairi, but also the Political Science Department and Andrew Hurl in particular for helping to pull together this talk. I'm very appreciative that you're here. I know it's a difficult time of the term, the last week of the term, so thank you for making time for this talk. As Nairi said, I will be presenting an overview of this recent book that just came out late last year. But because I'm trying to do an overview, I probably won't do justice to the idea that I will tell you a lot about specific practices. So I'm going to kind of rush through an overview of this book, but I hope I will leave enough time so that during the question and answer period, should you want more detail about some of the more precise research that I've done. It's really a book I've been working on in some ways for a couple of decades. I'd be happy to share that with you. The research, the main research questions in this book are, first, I'm arguing there's a new trend in international relations, a trend I call the justice cascade, which is a rise, a dramatic increase in prosecutions for individual criminal accountability for state officials who are responsible for human rights violations. And so my first question is, why are these state officials increasingly being held criminally accountable? So where does this trend come from? And then the second question, the second part of the book, is really about, well, what difference does it make? And particularly, if we begin to hold more and more state officials criminally accountable for human rights violations, can we deter crime in the future? Can we deter human rights violations? Can human rights prosecutions lead to improvements in human rights practices? Now, those two main research questions then lead to two further issues. One is, how do the answers to these questions, how does this research help us advance theoretical debates, international relations theory, debates around norms, diffusion, compliance with international law, but also deterrence of crime, an important debate in sociology and criminology. And then finally, does this research provide any guidance for activists and policymakers? As many of you know, there's a huge debate today around issues of transitional justice. Should we have trials at all? What about retributive versus restorative justice, truth commissions versus prosecutions? And there are very heated debates about the role of the International Criminal Court. For example, is the International Criminal Court, by indicting leaders in Sudan or in Libya, for example, are they helping to improve the situation, or they're actually complicating the situation? And so this research also has a lot of implications for activists advocating justice and for makers making tough decisions about justice. So I just wanted to give you, this is basically the table of contents of the book, to give you an overview of the book. You'll see that these questions are represented in the parts of the book about creating individual criminal accountability, spreading ideas about individual criminal accountability, and then this part 3 of the book, is about effects. Do they make a difference? What I'm going to present to you today around effects, I'm going to present a piece about the emergence of individual criminal accountability, and then I'm going to talk about Chapter 6 here, which is based on a large and statistical study of the impact of human rights prosecutions using a database that I helped create with colleagues. But I want to just point out that there's two other chapters, so I won't have a chance to present. One specifically looking at the effects of human rights prosecutions in Latin America, where I've done much of my research. And then finally, a chapter on the United States. Anytime we talk about the importance of new global norms, people correctly ask, well, if there really are important new norms, do they make a difference for the powerful actors in the system? And so I've directly addressed that question by a chapter looking at Bush administration torture policy. And I ask, is the United States immune to the justice cascade? I am not going to talk about that research today, but I'd be really happy to answer any questions you have during the question and answer period about that chapter. So first, to talk about the question 1, where does this new trend come from towards individual criminal accountability? It's important first to kind of lay out that we can think of three major models of accountability that have existed historically and that continue to exist. The first we can call the sovereign immunity model. Some people would call it the impunity model. And this is mainly before World War II, state officials were simply never held accountable for human rights violations. So if you were an individual criminal and you murdered one person, you could expect that you might be taken to court and convicted and put in prison. If you were a state official and you ordered the murder of very many individuals, you could be virtually assured that you would never be held accountable. This model, of course, began to change with Holocaust and World War II, which revealed the deep political and moral flaws of the sovereign immunity model. Post-World War II, however, states, when they gathered to draft human rights law and draft the institutions, the United Nations institutions and the regional human rights institutions, mainly chose what I call the state accountability model. Most of the United Nations, as well as the regional courts, the European Court of Human Rights, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, use a state accountability model. That is, if there have been human rights violations committed by individual state officials in a state, the whole state is held accountable, and the whole state is asked to change its policies or to make remedies to victims. And that is still really most of the human rights machinery in the United Nations continues to work with that state accountability model. But nevertheless, we begin to see, especially in the 70s and 80s, the emergence of the individual criminal accountability model. And right now, some of the audience will be correctly saying, well, what about Nuremberg? And of course, Nuremberg, the Tokyo trials, and the successor trials, so-called successor trials after World War II, were indeed used individual criminal accountability models, right? Individuals were held accountable, were sent to prison. But in some ways, Nuremberg was the exception that proved the rule. That is, you could only use individual criminal accountability if countries were absolutely defeated in war. And so after Nuremberg and Tokyo and the successor trials, there was basically a 30-year gap before there was the re-emergence of the use of individual criminal accountability. And it re-emerges in Greece, and it re-emerges in Portugal in the 1970s, where for the first time states start holding their own officials criminally accountable for human rights violations that happened during previous authoritarian regimes. And since that time, since the 70s, we see this dramatic increase. This individual criminal accountability is happening at three levels. It's happening in international prosecutions. This is what we hear the most about. International lawyers, international relations scholars tend to focus on this top level. And so we hear a lot about the ad hoc tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the ICTY. We hear about the ICC, the International Criminal Court, of course. And some people think that when I talk about individual criminal accountability, I'm only talking about these international tribunals. And I think that what I'm bringing to this research that's rather different is I'm thinking about accountability at three levels: the international, the foreign or transnational prosecutions, and of course you here in the United Kingdom are very familiar with that because the most famous of the foreign prosecutions is the Pinochet case here in the Law Lords. But there have been many others as well, Argentines in Spain, CIA officials in Milan, Italy, who were held criminally accountable for extraordinary rendition off the streets of Milan. And then finally, and most importantly, the Justice Cascade involves domestic prosecutions, the prosecutions in a single country for human rights violations that happened in that country. Now, as I said earlier, we created a database of these three types of prosecutions. And this figure represents the cumulative prosecution years in the database. And in some ways, this is the figure of the Justice Cascade, this dramatic increase in prosecutions. And what you'll see is that the bulk of these prosecutions are indeed domestic, the black part of this chart. Most accountability is happening in domestic courts for human rights violations that happen in that country. Nevertheless, the foreign and the international prosecutions are a very important part of the overall system because they are the backup system. In the old days, if someone committed a crime and wanted to, or a leader committed violations and wanted to escape, they simply went into exile, very comfortable exile. the importance of foreign and international prosecutions is that they have made it more difficult for individuals to escape domestic prosecution, or they have made domestic prosecution seem, in fact, a more attractive option than it previously seemed. And again, you in the United Kingdom saw this very clearly in the Pinochet case. It wasn't until Pinochet was arrested in London that all of a sudden trials that had previously been impossible, apparently impossible to hold in Chile, the option of domestic prosecutions opened up in Chile after the arrest of Pinochet in the United Kingdom. And so there is an interactive effect between these three levels, which is why it's important to study them together and not individually. This just shows you something you already saw, but it breaks it down by percentage. So 62% of the prosecutions in the database are domestic prosecutions, 26% international, and 11% foreign. There are very interesting regional patterns in these prosecutions. And so what we find, for example, is that 55% of the prosecutions take place in the Americas. That number, it's not because 55% of human rights violations in the world have happened in the Americas. Okay? It's because Latin America has played a very, very important protagonist role in the development of human rights prosecutions in the world. But these are transitional prosecutions. They're prosecutions that take place in transitional countries. So these regional breakdowns also have something to do with regions that have had more transitions than other regions. So Latin America had a very extensive number of political transitions to democracy. And the regions of the world that are less represented, the Middle East and North Africa and Asia, are regions that have had few transitions. Okay, so for example, it's very possible now with the Arab Spring, with more democratic transitions in the Middle East and in North Africa, we're going to see that part of the pie representing the Middle East and North Africa to grow. And as the transitions become further away in Latin America, we're going to see that part of the pie shrink. And so it's both, there are important regional factors that influence this, but they're also just important sort of by definition. You can't have a transitional prosecution unless you've had a transition. I want to briefly show you, these are the breakdown for domestic prosecutions. I want to show you the breakdown for the foreign and international prosecutions as well. Here we get a different breakdown. I don't know if you can see that it's 51% Europe. Now this is a table about the region where the crime occurred, the region where the human rights violation occurred. Okay, not where the court is located. I have another one I'm not showing you about where the courts are located. But what this says, and I think contrary to what many people think, is that over half of the international and foreign prosecutions of the world are dealing with human rights violations that happened in Europe. Now, why? Largely due to the very, very important work of the ICTY, the Ad Hoc Tribunal for the Former Yugoslavia. The ICTY has been so active on so many cases in quite a few countries, as you know, in the former Yugoslavia, that they're dominating this landscape right now. As the ICTY begins to shut down its operations, which it's starting to do, and as the ICC, the International Criminal Court, begins to be a more important player, we're likely to see, of course, this role of Europe shrinking and, for example, the role of Africa increasing. Okay. Even so, I just want to point out that there does tend to be an assumption that international and foreign prosecutions are prosecutions in courts of the North for crimes that happened in the South. And I want to point out that just for the time being, what our database shows is that international foreign prosecutions tend to be mainly in courts in Europe for mainly crimes that happened in Europe. But this, I think, can and will change over time. This is a figure that tries to give you a big overview of the whole argument I'm making about the process of emergence of individual criminal accountability in the world. So I'm going to just briefly walk us through it. Basically what I'm saying here is that what I'm interested in is the emergence, and here the book actually, that it has here, the emergence of a decentralized interactive system of global accountability. I'm arguing that what we're seeing emerge is a decentralized interactive system of global accountability. It's decentralized because it's happening mainly in domestic courts all around the world, courts that are not cooperating with one another. Okay? It's interactive because what happens at one level has an influence that happens at another level. This is the point I made about the Pinochet conviction. What happened with the law lords in the United Kingdom then had effect, had an impact back in Chile and open space up in Chile for domestic prosecutions. That this process, I'm arguing, takes place in two streams and one stream bed. I know it's a bit trite, the water metaphor here. But this first stream one, the international prosecution stream, this is a stream everyone knows. It's not one I deal with very much in the book because this is the stream everyone tells you. And that is that it all starts with Nuremberg, and it goes directly from Nuremberg to the ICTY and the ICTR, and then to the Rome Statute to draft the International Criminal Court. And I'm not saying, I think this is one important stream. I'm not denying it's important. It's one important stream, but it's not the only. And I even believe it's not perhaps the most important. There's a second stream, these domestic prosecutions, that are usually ignored by scholars of international law and of international relations. And that are these domestic prosecutions that start, and as I said, in places like Greece and Portugal, continue in Argentina in '85, and we have about 23 countries in the database who have, when they arrive at Rome to help draft the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, about 23 countries have already held their own state officials accountable in their own domestic courts. And so they're helping draft the Rome Statute, and they're helping think about the doctrine of complementarity because they've already had some practice with how you can hold state officials accountable in your domestic courts. And I spent a lot of time in the book on that second stream because I believe that's the one that has been less well researched and we know less well. But then finally, what's also very important is what I call the construction of the hard law stream bed. And this hard law here is not all of human rights law. It's only those pieces of human rights law that provide elements for individual criminal accountability. And this is what makes the trials that happen in the 80s and 90s and later very different from the Nuremberg trials. As you know, one of the main accusations about the Nuremberg trials was that this was victor's justice and that this was ex post facto application of law. And so the hard law stream bed means that countries as states are drafting increasingly more precise and more complex treaties with provisions for individual criminal accountability. And so again, as you know, and the most important of these, of course, is the Convention Against Torture and the Rome Statute of the ICC. So as you know very well, when Pinochet is arrested in the United Kingdom, and of course the Chilean socialist government screams bloody murder, it's nevertheless your own law lords find that no, that Chile and the United Kingdom and Spain had all helped participate in the drafting of and had all ratified the Torture Convention. The Torture Convention had very clear provisions saying for universal jurisdiction, saying that a torture indeed could be prosecuted in any place where he or she was found. And so this meant that these new trials are standing upon a much firmer legal stream bed than Nuremberg did and than any previous successor trials did. The importance of that stream bed is that it makes me more persuaded that this trend is not one that's going to easily disappear, because it's a trend that is rooted on consensual international law that countries of the world have helped draft, and that have secondly had the choice about whether or not to ratify. And it is most applied to those countries that have ratified, have accepted the provisions for individual criminal accountability in these treaties. So just to briefly end this section about the emergence of individual criminal accountability, what we see, of course, is that some countries can hold their own leaders accountable and some cannot. And so the question is, what are the conditions to help explain why some countries are more likely to use domestic human rights prosecutions than others? And there are things that will be familiar to some of the political scientists in the room. So people who've worked on democracy in the developing world recognize this distinction between the ruptured versus the pacted transitions, right? It turns out that countries are more likely to hold human rights prosecution if they've had a ruptured transition, if the previous leaders are forced to step out of power and cannot set the conditions for the transition. So, Greece and Portugal were both ruptured transitions. Portugal because it was a revolution, Greece because the leaders, because of the debacle in Cyprus, were not able to set conditions and were forced to step out of power. Argentina was another important, Argentina and Bolivia with other important ruptured transitions. Argentina, as you know, because of the Malvinas-Falklands War. And in those circumstances, it is easier for the new regime to put those leaders on trial, not for their failure, not for their military failures, but for their human rights violations. Similar countries in similar situations that had pacted transitions were not able to hold early trials. And so we ask, of course, why can Greece and Portugal hold trials? Why can't Spain, even to this day, hold former state officials accountable for human rights violations during the Civil War? And it has a lot to do with the nature of the Spanish transition. Why can Argentina and Bolivia hold early trials, but initially Brazil and Uruguay cannot? And it's partly because both Brazil and Uruguay had these pacted transitions. In addition to the transitions, we also have the regions that have taken the lead in these prosecutions are regions where regional human rights law is already in place, and especially the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, as well as the European human rights system, were quite active in providing legal elements that helped countries make decisions about prosecuting their own officials. Again, some of you may be aware that the European Commission played an important role in Greece. During the dictatorship in Greece, the European Commission did a very important major report about human rights violations in Greece and especially torture in Greece, path-breaking work. At no point did the European Commission say to the Greek government, and you must hold your leaders criminally accountable for torture. Nevertheless, the previous work of the European Commission on torture in Greece did show that it was possible to produce evidence that would stand up in a court of law. And then finally, we tend to see these where domestic and regional human rights networks are strong. And again, they were initially stronger in Latin America and in Europe. So again, human rights prosecutions don't happen because governments decide one day it would be a good thing to do. They happen because mainly activist groups and very often groups of victims of human rights violations bring a lot of pressure from below to try to get accountability for past crimes. And so, not surprisingly, in those regions where you have strong activist networks, they keep the pressure on, and you're more likely to see accountability. I want to turn to the second question, the second research question, and that is the question of effectiveness. Okay, so we're starting to see this upsurge in prosecutions. What difference does it make? We could think about impact in lots of different ways. Today, I'm going to just really take on this one topic, and that what difference does it make for human rights itself, for human rights practices itself in these countries that decide to use prosecutions. And as I said, I'm talking about Chapter 6. But also I've explored this with regard to other issues. What difference does it make for democracy? What difference does it make for rule of law? And what difference does it make for conflict and war? Many of the policy debates, the most dramatic policy debates, are debates about these issues. The notion you can have justice or peace, right? What people are saying there is saying, if you prosecute, you're going to exacerbate conflict. You're going to lead to more civil war. And so you shouldn't prosecute. There's been a lot of people saying you shouldn't prosecute because you'll undermine these fragile democracies. And if there's a coup, things will get worse. And so because these are such important human issues, but also such important policy issues, our research tried to say, what can we say? What can we say using our large database about impact? Virtually all the studies of impact to date have been single country studies. And so there's excellent research on, well, what happens in Uganda, or what happens in Chile. But most of those single country studies, of course, have to use a counterfactual type of reasoning. They're saying if the International Criminal Court had not indicted President Bashir of Sudan, would the situation in Sudan be better? That's a counterfactual kind of method. Okay? Now, the problem with counterfactuals, as you know, is that one can provide equally plausible other counterfactuals. So a lot of people say the situation in Sudan would be better today if the ICC hadn't indicted Bashir. But some say the situation in Sudan would be worse today if the ICC hadn't indicted Bashir. And the truth is, we can't resolve that with a single country study. And so by bringing our database to bear on this question, we can ask, we can't tell you what's going to happen in Sudan, but we can tell you, looking at all of these countries that have held prosecutions, what can we say about are human rights on average getting better in countries that prosecute? So there are theories that predict that human rights prosecution should have a positive impact on human rights practices. And so compliance theories in international relations have long said that if you don't enforce international law, it's not going to make a difference. And in fact, I've been arguing with colleagues for a long time who said, oh, well, you study human rights, and of course human rights law is not going to make a difference because it's not enforced. So what do you expect? Of course it's meaningless. And so now I'm saying, well, it looks to me like these prosecutions are decentralized ways of enforcing international human rights law. So it looks like we're getting some enforcement. And that should be a good test of this theory to see whether more enforcement leads to more compliance. Likewise, deterrence theory in sociology suggests an increase in the likelihood of punishment should lead to a decrease in crime. Now, whenever I talk about deterrence theory, I need to make really clear, deterrence theory makes two arguments. One of them is about the severity of punishment, and one of them is about the likelihood of punishment. And the debate over the death penalty is a debate about the severity of punishment. There, as you know, there is not evidence that an increase in severity of punishment leads to a decrease in crime. There is evidence, however, from the second part of deterrence theory, that an increase in the likelihood of punishment leads to a decrease in crime. The international community, you might think of it as a natural experiment for that part of deterrence theory. Because in the international community, before the 1970s, there was a zero likelihood that state officials would ever be punished for human rights violations. So we've gone in a very short time to a situation of a zero likelihood of punishment to a situation of a positive sum. And the question is, what difference does that make? However, there are also other theories that predict that prosecutions are going to have a negative impact on trials. That prosecutions will have a negative impact on human rights practices. Right, and this is, again, democratization theory was very nervous about prosecution. Samuel Huntington was famously saying you should forget and forgive, and you shouldn't prosecute. Or he said, he said justice comes quickly or it does not come at all. If you're going to prosecute, you've got to do it fast, or else you've got to forget it. But O'Donnell and Schmitter and other democratization theorists were understandably anxious because they worried that these prosecutions would lead to coups, and they knew that coups could worsen the situation. But nowadays we have a kind of a resurgence in what I call realist theory of international relations, that this belief that the threat of dictators, that the threat of prosecutions will lead dictators either to entrench themselves in power and not leave power. This was the fear first with Libya when we had the ICC indictment, was that this would just cause Gaddafi to entrench himself in power, or the fear in a situation of civil war where both insurgents, both the armed combatants and the government may not come to the peace table because they fear that after a peace agreement either of them will be prosecuted. And so they just continue the war. And this is a bit the scenario that we've been hearing about in Uganda with the Lord's Resistance Army, right? Joseph Kony has said, get the ICC off my back or else we're not making peace here. So there are serious reservations by some theorists about the impact of trials. And so what we've done here is with our database, we're able to make empirical comparisons between countries. You know, there's, as you know, many countries in the world have experienced transition, and a portion of those countries have had human rights trial experience. And so what we're doing basically is we're comparing those countries with transitional trial experience to similar transitional countries that have not had trials. And that gets us to be able to ask, well, what difference does it make if you've had trials? And this quantitative, those of you who know my research know that I'm not a high-skilled quantitative researcher, but I have been working with very gifted graduate students, and especially with Hyunjun Kim, but now also with another student called Jeffrey Dancy, to do this quantitative work. And Hyunjun Kim and I published the results of this quantitative study, International Studies Quarterly, in December 2010. And then in the book, I summarize, in I think what I hope is a very accessible manner, the results of these joint quantitative studies I've been doing with my graduate students. And so today I'm not presenting regression tables, but I'm just presenting a very simple representation of the findings of our quantitative study. But those of you who want to see the regression tables, you can find them in International Studies Quarterly, December 2010. So this is a kind of a representation. The top one here is a representation of kind of the basic finding of the more complex regression. Here we're just looking at averages. What we're doing here is we're taking a repression score for countries. Okay, so this is the repression score. The higher it gets, the worse it is. This repression score is being used by many political scientists and other social scientists today. It's a number that's coded for each country of the world, and it's coded from Amnesty International annual reports, and it's coded from U.S. State Department annual reports. Okay, and it's only for a small handful of rights. It's only for torture, disappearance, summary execution, and political imprisonment. Okay, so that's what we call repression, and not human rights. It's not the whole range of human rights. It's just this narrow set of rights that we can call repression. So what we're seeing here is that the gray line here is the global mean for all of our transitional countries, the global repression mean for all the transitional countries. The dotted black line are states with no trial experience. And the dashed black line are states with trial experience. And what you see here is by about 1994, we see a pretty stable pattern, and that is that countries with trial experiences are seeing statistically significantly lower levels of repression than countries with no trial experience. In the second table, we try to say, well, what does it make a difference if country has only one-year trial experience versus multiple trial years? And it's not quite so clear here. Again, we have our global mean for all our transitional countries. The dotted are states with one trial year. The dashed are states with multiple trial years. But we again do see that the states with multiple trial years over time seem to be having lower repression scores than states with only one trial year. And both of those are lower than states with than the global mean. I also have a similar, just looking at Latin America, I have a similar kind of averages. Again, averages. Here we're averaging the repression score. Again, remember, the higher the number, the worse the level of repression. And what you see again is for all the average human rights score is 2.91 for all transitional countries in Latin America. Countries with no prosecutions, higher level, 3.15, and then the more years of prosecutions, the more the repression level falls. Now, again, I'm going to finish this off here, and then I'll take questions. Any questions you have about the database or about the arguments here. Let me just say that some of the theoretical conclusions, things I've already presented, but I want to emphasize here. First, that the Justice Cascade was the result of the global human rights movement, both in its drafting of the hard law streambed and pushing forward for human rights prosecutions. Secondly, that prosecutions don't happen everywhere, of course, that there are certain conditions that make prosecutions more likely in some countries than in others. And then finally, the point I'm making that the use of human rights prosecutions is associated with improvements in human rights, probably as a result of some combination of deterrence, that is increasing the likelihood of punishment, and normative socialization. And this is what we don't have sorted out yet and what I'm continuing to work on, because we know that trials punish, and so we know that there is this deterrence effect, but we also know that trials are high-profile, normative, performative, symbolic events. So they also communicate norms. And because they do both those things simultaneously, we can't easily sort out why they're doing the work they're doing. We don't know if it's mainly because they punish or if it's mainly because they communicate norms. And the truth is we think it's both. We think those two are working together, that there's kind of a rationalist punishment factor that's having an impact, but there's also a powerful normative communication dynamic going on. And then I want to finish just with some of the policy implications here. First, that you know, as a result of this research, I've come to believe strongly that prosecutions are an important policy tool for improving human rights practices. Now, and I want to clarify this because sometimes my argument, I think, is my policy argument is really misunderstood and even distorted. I am not saying that every state official who committed a human rights violation should immediately be prosecuted and sent to prison. Okay, I'm not saying that. Sometimes my work has been characterized as saying that. To the contrary, I would say that prosecutions do not have to be implemented immediately. One of the clearest things I've found is that Huntington, when he said justice must come quickly or not at all, was simply wrong. We have found that justice sometimes comes quickly, but usually comes very slowly, sometimes painfully slowly for victims. Justice does not have to come quickly, and it does not have to be complete. That partial and delayed justice can have this same positive effect on human rights that we are seeing in our studies. Finally, and this I haven't as much time to talk about, but especially from these Latin American cases where we had remember, 50% of the cases in the database are from Latin America, and they're some of the earliest cases. So we've had now over 20 years in some cases to really look at those Latin American cases. And what we're finding is there is not evidence that prosecutions undermine democracy or exacerbate conflict. To the contrary, in Latin America, it's a region that has had the most prosecutions in the world at the same time as its consolidated democracies throughout the region. There have been no coups in the region as a result of human rights prosecutions. No successful coups. There have been coup attempts in Argentina, but there have been no successful coups in the region as a result of prosecutions. Likewise, Latin America in this period has gone from being a region full of conflict. There were 17 various forms of civil conflict at the beginning of this period. There's only one going on today, Colombia. Okay? So at the same time as this powerful process of accountability has gone in the region, conflict has diminished dramatically. And then finally, I want to say, and this is really important, this is a book about prosecution, so I've been talking this whole time about prosecutions. But nothing I have to say about prosecutions implies that they cannot or should not be combined with other forms of transitional justice. To the contrary, we find that all of these either-or dichotomies that are presented in the literature, you know, truth or justice, retributive justice or restorative justice, justice or peace, those are red herrings often. The countries that are doing the best job are the countries that are using multiple, simultaneous, overlapping forms of transitional justice. So the fact that you use a truth commission does not keep you from using a trial in most cases. All the Latin American cases that use truth commissions also use trials. It doesn't keep you from doing reparations. It doesn't even keep you from using traditional forms of justice, which have been appropriately combined in some cases with criminal justice. And so the one point I want to leave you with, though, is the research that I have done and other scholars also working in this area, people like Lee Payne, many of you know her research here. What we're finding is that whatever the mix is of transitional justice, and there's many good mixes, whatever the mix is, you need to have criminal prosecutions as part of the mix, because if you don't have criminal prosecutions as part of the mix, you're not seeing this improvement in human rights in our quantitative studies. Okay, so it's not, the lesson is not that everyone should prosecute immediately and not do anything else. No, it makes great sense to use a wide range of mechanisms, but in that mix, you need to have prosecutions as one important piece of your transitional justice package. Thank you very much.